Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome back to the Learning from Financial Fraud series on the Treasury Update podcast. In this series, we explore multiple major financial fraud cases, we discuss how each one occurred and was kept hidden for a period of time, and we'll dissect how it was eventually discovered and get insight and guidance on how to prevent this type of situation from happening to you and your organization. I'm Jonathan, Media Production Specialist here at Strategic Treasurer, and I'm here again with Craig Jeffery, Managing Partner. Welcome back to the show.
I'm glad to be here. There's certainly been fraud occurring. We just haven't been covering it. This one's quite a bit different than some of the others because it's about fraud against this particular person, but there's quite a bit we can learn if you're seeking to protect your assets, or your company's assets.
True. So I heard about this right before I went to AFP, and I saw the large number associated with it, and I was like, what? Why is nobody talking about this? So can you walk us through the situation of a $230 million US social engineering theft?
Yeah, and just by way of background, this is still an alleged crime. Defendants are presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. So that's just some of the clarifications. But we'll talk about it a little more openly on there. So in the summer, August 19th of 2024, five young adults ran and created one of the largest and what's referred to as one of the most sophisticated crypto heists in history against a person. What they did is they leveraged social engineering and some software to gain access to a person, to their computer, to their cryptocurrency, and exfiltrated all of the codes and information out and stole over $230 million worth of digital currency from them. This was a significant, massive loss for the person and very notable in terms of the sum.
Yeah, and recently I watched a movie. This is not a recommendation to go watch it, but at the beginning of it, it starts out with a scam that's very similar to this. And I had watched that just before I'd heard about this story. It's called The Beekeeper, and it starts with this lady who's a signer for, she's a signer for a foundation, and they get into her computer and send these messages that look like her software is triggering these warnings. So she makes the call and talks to the criminal on the other side. That movie, of course, is all made up, but I just thought it was funny because there's these similarities here. Do you want to go through what the attack is now that it's interesting to see it coming into popularity? These scams are being shown in pretty popular movies now.
Yeah, so if you had $230 million worth of precious metals that'd be in some giant vault, very hard to take them out, physical or require physical proximity. Cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, there's digital activity, and since your computer may be accessible, directly from the internet, from wherever the criminals are operating, that can take place. But the criminals identified a target, and they were able to impersonate, in this case, Google support through a spoofed phone number. So when the person got a call, it said, I don't know if it said Google support or whatever it said on there. And they were able to convince the target that they were Google support and that his accounts had been compromised, and that they had suggestions to provide additional encryption and security, provided this person with software to lock it down, to provide multi-factor authentication. And what happened is they used that software to gain access to the victim's computer. And then through this activity, they were going through that process. They were able to reset the two-factor authentication, gain access to it. Since they had access to the desktop, they could monitor whatever was going on in real time. Eventually, they were able to manipulate the victim into opening files with the private keys so that the information could be seen, used, and downloaded. There's over 4,000 Bitcoins in there that they stole. They emptied everything from his account. And so they exfiltrated the money out, and using what the prosecutors say is very sophisticated, used it to move the money out into accounts and methods that they could use to buy and live a very lavish lifestyle for a period of time.
Yeah, you can live a pretty lavish lifestyle with $230 million.
Yeah, I think they one of them was a peak night was spending over $500,000 at a party. Yeah, you'll blow through your $230 million pretty quick at that rate. But very, very expensive. So a couple of things on this. Why does this matter? I mean, this idea of being very wary, doubtful, and skeptical makes sense. Like in the example of your movie, they were able to trigger it so the person called. So they think, hey, I initiated the call. I'm in good shape, whether that's intercepted or not. You still need to do essentially multi-factor authentication with who you're calling when the stakes are quite high. In this case, they were able to convince the person by going after them. There's quite a lot that can be learned from that just by being careful. I mean, if you're protecting $10, you don't need to be as careful as $1,000 or as careful as $100,000 or $1 million or $230 million. That level of care, protection should be significantly larger. Diversification's probably not a bad idea as well at that level.
True. Yeah, and you went over some of the loss already, but do you want to go a little more into how they were able to get the funds and transfer them so that they could use them to have these parties and buy the cars and the houses that they bought?
So Bitcoin is a digital currency. There are some places where you can trade certain amounts, but when you're renting houses for $68,000 a month, you're buying Lamborghinis or renting Lamborghinis for your parents, are spending all kinds of money. Some places don't accept Bitcoin or other digital currency. And so how did they move it out? Some examples were that they would use peel chain, where you would convert your Bitcoin, break it up into smaller components, maybe even to other currencies like Ethereum or Litecoin, just using one digital currency to convert to another, smaller amounts. There's lots and lots of transactions. Bitcoin, for example, rides on public ledgers, distributed ledgers. So some of the information stored that's accessible and available from multiple sites through multiple servers. And so when they, continue to put, they continue to do transactions, it kind of builds on who owns it, who has access to the transactions. You may not know who owns it or who any of the individual parties are until it finds its way into a bank account or until there's a link to that transaction. So moving huge sums of money would likely in the banking system trigger some type of SAR report, a suspicious activity report, as why is so many millions of dollars being moved? Smaller amounts, especially as they get below $10,000, will tend to fall outside of that realm. And so this is breaking it apart so it avoids regular and common detection. You have to get it so it can flow through some sort of banking system at some level so you can use it. If you can't trade directly in the cryptocurrency or buy everything through, in this case, Bitcoin. So they use that. That was what was sophisticated, breaking it down, moving it so they could gain access to the funds, not just to the Bitcoin, but to the funds.
So from the time that the crime happened to when they got caught was about 1 month. Not very long for running and hiding, but what kind of things did they do to not be caught, and what did they do that ended up triggering these red flags and having them get found out?
Yeah, so if you lose $2,300, there's not going to be any action by law enforcement if it's stolen digitally, right? There's just so many of those that are going on, nobody to pay attention. When you have this kind of loss where it's high tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, there's a lot of tension on it. So how did they hide things and cover up what they were doing? One method is a common security method. It's a helpful method for not just criminals, but for maintaining, a level of security as you're logging into different sites. As you might use a VPN, a virtual private network. So you have a tunnel going into the internet, and it may look like you're coming in from France, Switzerland, Canada, some other place in the United States, Mexico, et cetera. So it masks where you're coming in from. So now this traceability of where did this login come from, that's a common practice for being secure, and it's certainly a way of being anonymous if you're doing criminal activity. Now, one of the things that got away from them is when they first started, they didn't use a VPN. Then all their subsequent transactions, they were using a VPN. So there was still a trail that led the prosecutors and the law enforcement to be able to locate them based upon IP addresses that they use that were actual IP addresses, not disguised through a VPN. That was quite a significant way of running into the problem. So they had created it. I think they even shared that there was an IP address that was related to a rental in Encino, California. They're paying $47,500 a month in Encino, and they were able to link back to that. So they eventually caught this particular person while on vacation in the Maldives. So, it's interesting, John, because it's like that provided information on location where the person was. And so figuring out proximity, someone's renting the property in their own name or, with their own resources, card information. So they were able to point the person there to that location, that those transactions occurred from that location. Subsequent transactions coming in from the VPN can then all be tied back to that. But that's true from public ledger activities, right? These distributed ledgers have ledgers of what activity occurred. And once you find the person and their information, you have the ability to go in and locate, here's the transactions that occurred. It's not as anonymous. That there's anonymity, but there's also traceability. So once someone is no longer anonymous, now that activity, the law enforcement group can find that activity and trace it back to who did the criminal activity.
In the past episodes, we've talked about criminals within a certain amount of time moving all the funds out of the banking system to offshore accounts or moving it into crypto. Is using crypto easier to track because of public ledgers, or is it more difficult? What's the comparison there?
Yeah, how is it different might be how I'd approach answering that is, if you're running things through bank accounts, all the activity is tracked that runs through the bank account. Cash that you're operating in there's no tracking of the cash unless you're moving a large sum of money. So there's the majority of your activity for most people, almost all companies, is going to be tracked through the banking system or available to be monitored or researched if there's crime through the banking system. On crypto, if it's a public ledger and there's access to it, there would be a way to find out if you can link a crime to the transaction and find the chain. You might be able to get back to the person. But what muddies that up is if you have a lot and you start selling pieces of it off, you start converting smaller dollars. There's so many transactions. Whose are they? And how would you link that to the fact that was money from a ill-gotten source? You might not know it unless you can link it. Then you'd be able to link the whole process. So in some ways, it would be similar to a banking system, because if you tracked all the transfers, you'd be able to see that trail. But the same is true of the public ledger that would be accessible. If it's accessible, you would be able to track and build that once you found this was a criminal, these are the activities that occurred, you'd be able to trace it back to see what was done.
Okay. So you mentioned the $500,000 night spent in the LA clubs. What else did they spend their ill-gotten gains on?
One of the young alleged criminals spent over $500,000 at one night at an LA nightclub and spent huge sums other nights as well. He spent over $10.5 million renting a mansion in Miami and chartering a private jet. Bought lots of luxury cars, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, and others. Gave away all kinds of gifts to people, which caught a lot of attention of the different social media crowd, where they're like, he just gave me this really expensive bag. That raises a lot of attention. You don't want to be found. Don't be flashy with all the money.
The other funny thing I saw is online, there's so much video of these guys spending their money and like them at the clubs and them buying the cars and driving the cars. And two of the cars, they hit each other with them and they needed repairs. And so even when the FBI went to go repossess these items, a lot of them were damaged. So they're just reckless with them.
They purchased 31 luxury vehicles, or they admitted to purchasing 31, and 22 they haven't, as of the time of the story that you and I were looking at, 22 hadn't been recovered yet. So they've recovered 9 items. Like, okay, that's really, you gotta pay attention to your cars, right? Just because you stole a lot of money doesn't mean you need to completely waste it.
Yeah, well, in this case, they did. What other things can finance and treasury learn from this, even though it happened to a individual?
Yeah, where there's money, there are criminals looking to get that money, and they will take different steps to ensure they get it, right? And so in related, we saw, kidnapping as a way to extort money. We saw social engineering, human engineering to gain access to find where stored value was, and the use of technology to uncover the keys. I think we need to think about that carefully. If you had a pile of gold and you saw the value is gleaming, you would think I need to have, walls around it, fences around it, armed guards, digital guards, and digital security, and be able to thwart someone who's trying to steal it. Just because it's not physically apparent that it's like a pile of gold, it's still worth quite a bit. And your effort and care to protect it is really, really important. So social engineering, we need to be on guard for that. We need to be regularly trained and tested on that. Regular training awareness on digital security, cybersecurity, payment security, protection of assets, digital assets, needs to be done extremely thoroughly by companies. You need to have regular training, not every 5 years, not every 2 years, usually every year and multiple times per year to protect it.
Can you go more into the specifics on how training could have helped this guy? Like, he's getting these messages from Google support. What's a best practice that we would teach?
That's a really good question, because if you call in and you say you're so-and-so and you need to reset your ID or get a new card or whatever it is, they will ask you for additional information, multi-factor authentication. Are you aware of the different transactions that occurred? They might ask you for a birth date. They'll ask you for more information, or they may send a code to your phone. You have to get the code to them so that they can be sure they know that that's you. At the same time, okay, that's them protecting themselves, so they're not getting scammed and giving away your assets or your access to information. I mean, if you go get a new phone, the level of security they have before they can open up and look at your account is far higher, right? Because people try to steal phone numbers and phones because they know people use phones for multi-factor authentication. But when you're calling or someone's calling you, you shouldn't just believe that it's a legitimate call. You should have your own process of making sure it's safe. Why are they calling you? I'm calling from Windows, right? Or I'm calling from Google support. I'm calling from Microsoft. Okay, they're calling you because of what reason? Your stuff is not secure. Does that make sense? That skepticism is not just after the fact, like we look at this and say, how could you be so smart that you have $250 million in Bitcoin and fall for something like that? It's easy to get trapped into this pattern of there's a few things that seem to align, and now I trust the person, and now I start to give more information to follow it. So your multi-factor authentication, if you're calling, whether you originate the call or whether someone calls you, there should be some additional validation before you start giving away keys that exist. An outright bold lie doesn't convince people. But if you couple it with a few truthful things, people are more likely to believe the lie and know that. Just be careful. Like, who are you going to grant access into the room with the gold? You're going to be more cautious as you think about going through each door. And that's true with your digital access and your digital security. The keys that you have aren't physical keys, they're digital keys. Your multi-factor authentication, the codes that get sent to your phone. And so you see banks all the time. They say, be on the alert for these scams. They send the message with the code, says, don't give this to anybody. We'll never ask for it. But people ask for it all the time, and they do. So think about how that process would work, where you need to tighten down your own processes. Maybe you've given away stuff more readily than you should, data and information, and haven't been caught by that, but you could, and you could get caught very easily, even if you don't have 230 million sitting on your Google Drive.
Interesting. Well, thanks for sharing the details of this and your insights on it. And for all of our listeners, we've got 13 other episodes that are similar to this in our Learning from Financial Fraud series, and I'll link those down in the description. So scroll through those and see if any of those are interesting to you. And thanks for listening.
reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.